Welcome friends to another day of Q&As, joined by my lovely and helpful wife Lucie.
Hi guys.
For future reference, I have a post on my Instagram called Ask Leo. That's where you can ask questions to get them answered here. Let's answer one of our questions from Instagram.
So the next question is by Taj Bajwa, N3. Talk about clenbuterol and its danger. I used it for 6 months straight at 40 microgram a day. I think it impacted me negatively, my anxiousness and anger.
Thank you, Lucie. Thank you, Taj, for your question. So I guess this will be the video on clenbuterol. I get asked a lot about clenbuterol. People know I have generally negative feelings toward it. For Lucie's sake and for those that don't know, clenbuterol is a drug used by bodybuilders mainly to lose weight. It is a synthetic drug that agonizes a class of receptors called the beta adrenergic receptors. The beta adrenergic receptors are receptors that naturally get agonized, meaning this thing binds to it and positively stimulates it by adrenaline and noradrenaline. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are called in the US epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are the terms in Europe that they're called. So generally, just for you guys to know, norepinephrine is always more available in our blood than adrenaline. Not always, but most of the time. However, adrenaline responds more to stress. When we get stressed, we produce more adrenaline. And adrenaline has, well, I won't get into the different agonism of the receptors. But the important thing is that these beta receptors were distinguished from alpha receptors in the 1940s. Originally, it was thought that we only had 2 beta receptors, beta 1 and beta 2. Later, beta 3 was found in the adipocytes, which means in the fat of animals. Much later, I think in 2019, I've mentioned this in another video. So for a long time, people thought that the beta 3 receptors were important for the thermogenesis in fat, so brown fat, which creates energy, it's mitochondria rich. People thought that agonizing the beta 3 receptors caused that to happen. Recently, there's a 2019 paper that seems to postulate that it may be actually the beta 1 receptor that is responsible for the browning of fat, even though beta 3 are still found a lot in fat. Now, between animals, this is a bit off topic, but just so you guys know, between animals, so within one animal, like a human, the beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 receptors share 50% of their sequence. Between animals, so my beta 1 receptor shares about 75% of its sequence with a rat's beta 1 receptor.
Okay.
So my beta 1 receptor is more similar to a rat's beta 1 receptor than the rat's beta 1 receptor is to its beta 2 receptor. Anyway, so they're a little bit different, each of the receptors. Now generally the research on these beta receptors for adrenaline have been targeted to 2 things. One is to dilate the bronchi of lungs, so for asthmatics to be able to breathe. And the second target has been to reduce heart rate or relax the blood vessels. So for the purpose of reducing heart rate and all of that, what people have been trying to do is get selective beta 1 receptor antagonists. Like atenolol is a great example of that. It's quite selective for the beta, the best example really is nebivolol, although it's a bit different. That's the most selective for the beta 1 receptor. Anyway, on the other hand, for the asthmatics, they want to agonize the beta receptors. And they particularly want to agonize the beta 2 receptors. So one of the drugs used for that is albuterol. Clenbuterol was researched for that, and so on. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't know when Dan Duchaine first discovered clenbuterol. I talked to John Romano about it. The interesting thing is that Dan, I'm going to discuss this with you guys here, but basically Dan's understanding of clenbuterol was wrong. He thought that clenbuterol would raise basal metabolic rate, which there is no evidence of that. In fact, there's evidence to the opposite. But he thought that would happen because he saw that a side effect of clenbuterol was tremors in the hands.
I see.
The reason for this side effect of tremors in the hands is that in the brain, beta 2 receptors are found more in the areas that guide motor function. So they guide how you move, whereas beta 1 receptors are in other places. So agonizing preferentially the beta 2 receptors causes more shaking. But this doesn't actually increase basal metabolic rate. I'll explain later how clenbuterol works. The interesting thing is he seems to have introduced it to bodybuilding in the early 1990s, sometime around then. At the same time, actually this was first discovered in probably the 60s or so, but by the early 90s, clenbuterol was being fed to livestock illegally around the world at 10 to 100 times the therapeutic dose for asthmatics.
Oh.
At this dose level, clenbuterol increased the musculature of cattle and decreased their fat content. So, for example, in 1993, I read a paper saying that 5 to 6% of all beef contained clenbuterol in it. And in fact, there were many incidents of intoxication of people eating beef that contained so much clenbuterol that they would start shaking, heart rate would elevate, and so on.
It's illegal now, right?
Yeah, it was illegal then.
Oh, they were just using
Yeah, they were. But actually, there's a funny story of one guy who was taking atenolol, I guess for cardiac reasons, and the people eating with him all got intoxicated, but he didn't because the atenolol was blocking the clenbuterol's effect on the beta-1 receptors.
I see.
So, which maybe I should mention now, actually, before I get into how this thing really works. I should mention. So, clenbuterol was thought to be very selective for the beta-2 receptors, but it's not that selective. It agonizes the beta-1 receptors, and most of these things also do. It's just slightly different preferentialness. So, the ones that are the most preferential, or selective, sorry, not preferential, is nebivolol, which I mentioned already for the beta-1 receptor, and which is just so you guys know, it's an antagonist, not an agonist.
Okay.
And the most selective for the beta-2 receptor starts with an S. It's called the salmeterol, something like that. You guys can find it easily. It starts with an S, salmeterol. It's the most selective for the beta-2 receptor. Now, one thing that matters also is the lipophilicity or hydrophilicity of the beta agonists. Hydrophilicity means that it's not fat soluble, which means it's much harder to get into the brain. Why does it matter if it gets into the brain? It's theorized that a lot of the weight loss that comes from these things comes from a appetite suppression element, which comes from the brain. So, clenbuterol is actually very lipid solid. It's lipophilic. Salmeterol, which is even more, has a greater affinity or a greater selectivity for the beta-2 receptors, is also lipophilic.
Okay.
So this is something interesting to postulate about. I don't know any reason that someone would take clenbuterol over salmeterol. Salmeterol seems like a better choice. In fact, there's a mouse study in which it was shown that even if you block the beta-1 receptors and give them clenbuterol, they still grow muscle. But if you block the beta-2 receptors, they don't. So it shows that even though clenbuterol is agonizing both receptors, the effect on muscle and fat, especially muscle, comes through the beta-2 receptor. Now, how does this effect happen, really? Basically, this is what happens. This whole beta system signaling is part of the whole steroid thing. When people take steroids, a lot of the muscle they're gaining is actually coming from the same process that clenbuterol works on, which is this. It binds to the beta-2 adrenergic receptors. When it does this, the beta-2 adrenergic receptor releases a protein which in turn stimulates adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase then stimulates cyclic adenosine monophosphate, cAMP. cAMP, in turn, along with its with CREB, the cAMP response element binding protein, both of those things alter gene transcription in the body. So this agonism of adrenaline, of the adrenaline receptors, changes gene transcription, just like a hormone does. And not only does it change gene transcription, which means which genes are being used in the body, but also in response to agonism of the receptor, it phosphorylates a couple of enzymes that are very important. So I'm forgetting the names exactly, but one of them is a lipase, which is very involved in the degradation of triglycerols. So it activates this enzyme, which then degrades fats.
I see.
It also inactivates an enzyme which is very important, it's acetyl-CoA something, which is very important to the synthesis of fat. I don't know why I'm forgetting the words, but the point is, it not only changes gene transcription, but it phosphorylates these enzymes, changing their activity specifically toward burning fat and stop synthesizing fat. So no more new fat, and we focus on burning fat, and we change gene transcription in a way that seems to enhance muscle building in the body. And what ends up happening is, what's been seen, so there's so many animal studies on this, what they show is that the animals, not only do they physically have more muscle and less fat after, and by the way, the animals that respond the best to this are beef, followed by sheep or goats, followed by pigs, followed by chickens. I don't know why this is important, but chickens respond the least to this. And actually
for size, no?
No, there's a theory why. They think that chickens, they've been bred to be the largest they can be as a bird. Or within their species, so they're limited. There's actually a theory on it. It's funny, I read about that also. But anyway, so the point is, so they've done muscle biopsies, and what they find is that there's a change in protease enzymes in the muscle, indicating that less muscle is being degraded and possibly more is being created. So basically the point is that beta adrenergic signaling, positive signaling, causes the body to change gene transcription and other activities that yield in the end greater muscle mass and more burning of fat and less synthesis of fat. They do not alter the basal metabolic rate. Now, this is hard for me to understand because in the acute sense they must increase the basal metabolic rate just by the increase in heart rate. But I think that in the long term, in the cattle studies, this is not increased, but the effect on fat and muscle remains. In fact, the effect on muscle appears to stay longer than the effect on fat. I'll include a citation here. So, basically what I'm trying to say with all of this is that Dan Duchaine was wrong. It's not about the shaking. It's actually a hormonal effect, a signaling effect, a change in gene transcription that, if you think about it, is already within the whole steroid pyramid. Steroids, for example, think about steroids that are very adrenergic, like trenbolone. These steroids, or halotestin, for example, these steroids cause a very strong adrenergic response. People can't sleep on trenbolone. That's why, by the way, halotestin makes you immediately stronger, significantly. All of that immediate thing is a change in adrenergic nerve signaling. And it's all due to the adrenergic effect. So, within that steroid thing is this adrenergic effect, and clenbuterol goes directly for that. Now, how could this thing be bettered? First of all, in my opinion, this is dangerous, and I'll tell you guys why I don't like clenbuterol or beta adrenergic signaling. But how could you improve upon this? Since you don't need the beta 1 receptor, due to the studies, we can see that the muscle still grows anyway. You block the beta 1 receptor selectively, like with nebivolol. And then you use an even more selective beta 2 agonist than clenbuterol, which is this salmeterol, or whatever it's called. I've never used salmeterol. I don't think anyone has used it for this purpose. But it's a better drug than clenbuterol. So, combining those two, you'll experience the least increase in your heart rate. Why does that matter? Because, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm not telling you guys to do this at all, but I'm just hypothetically, because when your heart rate increases the most, you have a higher risk of getting arrhythmias. And these arrhythmias don't just happen the first time you use it. Over a few years, look at a lot of ex-bodybuilders, they have pacemakers in their hearts because of this long-term clenbuterol use. So, at least block the beta 1 receptor, which is more available in the heart. The beta 2 receptor is found more in the muscle. But it's also in the heart, but more in the general muscle, skeletal muscle. So, block the beta 1 and use a more selective one. That's what I would do personally if I needed to use this. And I would think of it as a hormonal thing, not something just to make me jittery. The jittery element actually is just a consequence of the fact that the beta 2 receptors are in the brain in the motor area. Finally, so back to his main question is, and just to mention why I don't like this. Obviously, it's because the increased heart rate, the main thing, could basically cause damage to the heart in the long term, even if it doesn't cause arrhythmias. It makes your heart beat, resting heart rate higher.
Something to block the beta 1 receptor?
It'll still be a bit higher, but that's much safer. They don't take anything. They take clenbuterol, they're already on steroids, they already have an elevated resting heart rate, and now their resting heart rate is like 80 to 90 per minute, which is really damaging, And think about it, you have one heart. Think about it this way, you guys that lift weights, you lift weights a lot, everybody that lifts weights a lot with one muscle eventually damages that muscle. Eventually someone has a bicep tear if he's an arm wrestler or something. Something happens. If you make your heart work more than it needs to work, in the long term, at the basal rate, not when you're exercising, I want the heart rate to elevate. No, in the basal rate is 80 to 90 in the long term. You're going to have less time with that heart. That heart is you're going to experience eventually in life heart failure. So once you get heart failure, like there's this powerlifter who got it. I forgot his name. It's from California. But anyway, there's this guy who got a heart transplant. Someone can mention below. But that's what happens eventually. Your heart just the muscles, destroyed. So, but the point is, to answer his final question, he said that the long-term effect on him was greater aggression. He said, and anxiety.
Anger and anxiety.
Yeah. Well, first of all, adrenergic signaling is affected by serotonergic signaling. So specifically, there's a class of serotonin receptors called the 5-HT1 receptors. They're autoreceptors. The 5-HT1A receptor responds to adrenaline also. So there's a potential that the adrenergic signaling reduces serotonin. Serotonin is strongly associated inversely with impulsiveness and aggression, and also quite, debatably associated with anxiety. But I think it's, in my opinion, higher serotonergic signaling is less anxiety. But for sure, higher serotonergic signaling, less aggression, less impulsiveness.
Okay.
So that's one thing. The second thing is, having a higher adrenergic signaling in the beta-2, any beta receptor, basically puts you in a state of fight or flight. So what happens if your tiger is jumping to attack Lucie now? Lucie is not taking clenbuterol. You're not, right? You're not taking clenbuterol. So imagine a tiger comes up to you, and what happens? Your hypothalamus signals to the rest of your body that there is a danger, and your adrenaline, specifically adrenaline, gets released. It signals at the beta receptors and allows you to move, contract your muscles faster, and run away faster, which is helpful. Now, what happens to someone who's been at a war, in battles and stuff like that? They develop something called posttraumatic stress disorder. What is that from? Long-term beta or adrenergic. Yes, exactly. Sustained fight or flight response. Over time, it causes people to become vigilant, to become on edge, to be unable to turn off that sympathetic nervous tone. If you take a beta agonist, or even if you take an amphetamine, which will cause a resulting adrenergic stimulation also, in the long term, you'll end up with an anxious phenotype, and you'll end up basically on guard all the time. So that's what ends up happening. So it's very damaging. I have personal experience with this also, but not with clenbuterol. But I've definitely experienced that myself. It takes a lot of effort to heal yourself after this. And actually, I know a little bit about the fellow who asked the question, and I know he's averse to using SSRIs. And it's really a mistake, because the SSRI will work directly on that 5-HT1A receptor, which will block some of the beta. And another thing it could use is a beta blocker, which beta blockers also affect that 5-HT1A receptor and therefore affect serotonin transmission. But that's the way to heal a nervous system from it. The beta blocking and the SSRI. But, anyway, so the point is, Dan Duchaine was wrong. It's a hormonal effect. It increases protein synthesis. It decreases decreases fat synthesis. It increases fat, oxidation, and it's not good long term for your psychology or for your heart. All right. Thank you guys for your question. We'll see you next time.